Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Berkwhite and teach international law here at the law school and run Perry World House. I am delighted today both to introduce you to somebody you already know, Sarah Paletti, who runs our Human Rights Clinic and is going to help be part of the discussion. But more importantly, for today's purposes, not for my not wanting Sarah to be important, but for today's purposes, is Dante Paradiso. And Dante is the author of a book that we're going to talk about, The Embassy, The Story of War and Diplomacy. But I want to introduce Dante by framing the discussion a little bit. Many of you know I worked for Secretary Clinton in the State Department for a couple of years. And the thing I was most struck by was the extraordinary work that our Foreign Service officers do overseas. And too often when we're teaching international law, we talk about the Foreign Service officer posted in Geneva having tea at, the Hotel President Roosevelt and, maybe negotiating something over a fancy dinner. The reality is we have Foreign Service officers on the ground in some of the toughest places in the world. We appropriately pay enormous respect to our military who put their lives on the line every day. But the fact that isn't talked about as much is that we have Foreign Service officers who put their lives on the line every day. Occasionally, as we saw in Benghazi, they sacrifice their lives for our country. And that's a story that we don't hear very often. But it is the story of the real diplomacy that makes the difference of whether a country like Liberia descends into civil war, ethnic conflict, or genocide, or emerges as a functioning, safe democracy. And it is too bad that story doesn't get told, because when we go to Capitol Hill and ask for funding for the State Department, sometimes they'll provide the funding for building a fortress embassy 25 miles outside of the Capitol that really can't engage, but they very rarely will provide the funding for something as simple as a BlackBerry that might let one of our Foreign Service officers do their job. And what I love about the book you wrote is you show us what our Foreign Service officers have to do, from the ambassador to the regional security officer to the person on their first tour of duty who might be stamping embassies but also trying to at the same time cover the econ portfolio for a country, not just to represent America's interests, but to truly be the face of American civilian power and to transform these countries where we can make a difference and try to help. That's a story that needs to get heard, because without that story being told, the resources aren't there, the mindset of the department isn't there. And again, I love what our military does, but often they don't have the right toolkit. They don't have the toolkit of civilian diplomacy. They don't have the vision of understanding every last piece of the politics in a country, which is what it really takes. And in the embassy, you show that. And that, I think, is an enormous contribution, both to literature, but also to, I think, a really critical political imperative. And so Dante is a writer. He's also a lawyer, which for those of us in this room is important, but is also enormously valuable in the Foreign Service, not just in the legal advisor's office at the State Department, but so many of the issues that countries are dealing with, particularly in transition societies, are legal. He's also a Foreign Service officer who has served, and we were just talking about some of the posts, and I won't be able to repeat them all, but I'll tell you this. He has been right where the rubber meets the road, in the hardest, toughest places where the job is perhaps most important and most critical. And he's been able at the same time to write a wonderful book. It's an amazing story. It's extraordinarily well written, but it's also a story that is so politically important that I want to make sure every member of Congress, particularly those on the Foreign Affairs Committee that need to eventually fund the work of the State Department, have read. So I'm delighted to give you Dante Paradiso, the author of The Embassy, and someone who has also put his life on the line for the United States and for our mission around the world. So Dante, thanks so much for joining us at Penn Law.
Thanks, Bill. That was a great introduction. Really appreciate the kind words, both for the work of the Foreign Service and the State Department. Let me just start with a classic Foreign Service line. The views expressed here are my own and not those of the United States or the government or the State Department.
How you got the book through clearance, I have no idea, but somehow you did.
That's it. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you guys all for coming today. Appreciate your interest in hearing a pretty remarkable story. What I thought I would do, since the book is newly issued and they're still getting the hardcover out, it's still available for pre-order, but they're still working on it. What I thought I would do is give you guys a little bit of the story, and then we can have a bit of a conversation, because this is a story that happened in 2003, but I think it's highly topical today because it deals with issues that Bill touched upon, specifically, embassy security, human security, and diplomacy, the core of diplomacy, which is war and peace, and the decisions that are made every day by peacekeepers, by diplomats, by combatants, by non-governmental organizations, and by people in affected countries about how to try to put a broken situation back together, or not to break a situation. The book deals with a very narrow time frame, and it turned out to be the inflection point between a long-standing civil war in Liberia. Liberians have subsequently broken the history into two periods. They call it the Second Liberian Civil War. But really, it was a continuation of fighting and instability that had started all the way back in 1980 with a coup. So I'm not going to rehash the whole history for you guys. I just would say that in the book, I deal with a period from June to August 2003, when Liberia was at the point of complete disintegration. And it was either going to disintegrate and devolve into factional fighting from which there probably was no return in any sort of foreseeable future, or it was going to roughly stabilize and move back on the path of rejoining the community of nations. And I say rejoining because the seminal figure of the time was Charles Taylor, who was a warlord who had a reputation for fomenting instability not only in Liberia but throughout the sub-region in West Africa. And for his actions, specifically for supporting proxies, particularly in Sierra Leone, who committed some of the worst atrocities that you can imagine, most famously maiming children, cutting off their arms. They had names for these cuts. They called it short sleeve if they cut you up here, long sleeve if they cut you at the wrist. And they would throw the arms into piles and try to scare people. They did this for a generation of kids in Sierra Leone. And Charles Taylor was viewed as the source of financing and support and sustainment for the Revolutionary United Front that committed these atrocities. So the United States, other countries, other interested countries in the region put sanctions on the regime. And so the regime was quite isolated in 2003. By isolated, I mean that they had a lot of officials on travel bans, so they couldn't move freely out of the country. There was a humanitarian crisis, but not a lot of money being directed toward it. It was basically out of the headlines. And the United States was seized with the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So we had gone into Afghanistan and just gone into Iraq. And at the time, Iraq was going to be viewed as a short, quick, lightning success. And so you came around to June 2003, we had a massive number of troops deployed over there. They were starting the Coalition Provision Authority. And the very first signs of true instability in Iraq that would evolve into al-Qaeda in Iraq and the other problems that we're still grappling with today were just appearing at the time. But the main effort was there in terms of the American military power. Liberia was off the map in sort of every sense of the word, with one exception. The Sierra Leone had just ended its civil war, aided by British intervention, and Côte d'Ivoire, which was another neighbor of Liberia's, had also just more or less ended a civil war. It would spark back up a couple times after that, but they had reached a peace agreement, and they had some French intervention there. And yet Liberia was still unstable. And the reason it was unstable is because when Charles Taylor had initially come to power in 1997, it was a sort of an exit strategy for the international community. The country had been at war, there were a bunch of factions. Taylor was the strongest faction member, and they held a hastily convened election. He won the election with a campaign slogan that was shouted in the streets of, "You killed my ma, you killed my pa, I'll vote for you." So, you know, he and his team jokingly kind of embraced this sort of bad boy image. But it became less of a joke after the atrocities that were committed in Liberia and then the horrors of Sierra Leone. And it was clear that the regime was not going to change direction after Taylor got into power. They still ran basically a cash and carry economy. There were still human rights abuses being committed. And they held a disarmament campaign in the late 90s, and they disarmed the rebels, and the human rights abuses still continued. And so in early 2000, around that time, a new coalition of the old factions came together, and they set out on a new war to oust Charles Taylor. And so we come to June 2003, and another rebel group had come about in early 2003, coming from Cote d'Ivoire. And the first group was coming from the border of Guinea and Sierra Leone. Two rebel groups were converging on the capital. And Charles Taylor, who had long resisted a peace agreement and peace talks, said, "Okay, I'll go to Accra, the international community, led by a Nigerian mediator, General Abubakar, and really put together by ECOWAS, which was the sub-regional group, put together a peace conference in Accra. And Charles Taylor decided to attend, you know, frankly, because they were losing a lot of ground. His forces weren't getting paid. They were unhappy and not really fighting. And so the rebels were making significant inroads into his territory and his control of Liberia. But a Sierra Leone had started up something called the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And the idea was to get justice for those killed in the Sierra Leone War. But most people in the international community believe that Charles Taylor was the target of this court, not for abuses committed in Liberia, but for the Sierra Leone abuses. So Taylor traveled in early June to go to the peace conference. He went to the opening of the peace conference, and the court, which was also received U.S. congressional funding, millions of dollars of it, decided that their strategy was to unseal an indictment. It was a kind of an open secret that Taylor had been indicted by the court, but it just wasn't known, and so it wasn't really talked about. And so they decided in early June, when he traveled to the peace conference, the head of state is out of the country. They're going to unseal this indictment and hope that the Ghanaians are going to render him immediately to the court. The problem with that is when you remove the head of state from a country that is essentially a coalition, you know, controlled by a coalition of militia and paramilitary forces, that's their commander-in-chief. The target then becomes the population itself. And they did that, and as soon as the indictment was announced, the Ghanaians said, we don't want Liberia to completely unwind. So they flew Taylor back. But on the ground, everybody was in shock. You know, the information, nobody understood what an indictment was. Does it mean the head of state is not coming back? So those of us who were on the ground and had this experience where you don't know whether the population is going to be attacked. And in fact, population was attacked. People were killed, but most people just fled the streets. So the moment it was announced over the radio, people just started running everywhere in the city. And they went to ground, and the militia basically took control of the city. The rebels said, okay, this is a signal from the international community that Taylor really is illegitimate. And so the peace agreement, the peace negotiations that had just opened, they announced it, almost simultaneous with the opening of the peace talks, were basically thrown into limbo. And the rebels then sent the signal and they attacked the capital. So that's essentially where the story that I tell in this book opens. And then over the next 3 months, what happened was the rebels attacked 3 times. They would attack, come in, cause a lot of damage, but they couldn't oust Taylor. And over the course of 3 attacks, they eventually split the city in half. And the geography of Monrovia is such that there's a big island called Bushrod Island. And that looks a little bit like Manhattan. And then there's the rest of Monrovia, which you could call the boroughs, but that's where the executive mansion is. The rebels got all the way down and eventually occupied this island, and they were there to stay. They were there to basically take power. And the commanding general of the Lord rebel forces, his real goal was to exact revenge. He had old disputes with Taylor's forces, and they were going to exact revenge. But that group did not have a mandate to govern. So even though Taylor was deeply unpopular, the population was somewhat held hostage to his paramilitary forces and militia. Nobody really wanted to live under either of the 2 rebel groups. And this one rebel group comes in, takes half the city. The other rebel group was coming up from the south. And so what you were looking at is a complete replay of the 90s where you're going to break down and go into factional fighting with no particular end in sight. There was no end game. There was no credible force that would come in. And you didn't know what was going to happen in the peace talks. So what do you do in that situation if you're a United States embassy? What do you do if you're an ambassador in that situation? The first instinct, if you're trying to manage this from Washington, is pull your people out, because there's no real good sides to this. You can't say, well, if the rebels come in, we can negotiate. You really don't know who you're getting, and you don't know who they want to kill. And you're on the front lines and you're in the middle of it. Well, Ambassador Blaney saw it differently. He saw it, and he was our ambassador at the time, Ambassador John Blaney. And he said, Liberia was a country that was founded by the United States in the 1820s. We have a long connection with this country. And if we were to pull out, we were the last diplomatic mission standing. The EU had a very small residual presence of people under the European Commission, but all the other embassies had basically gotten out into factional fightings in the 90s. And even the Nigerians and the Ghanaians and other regional players had basically pulled their staff. The Lebanese were down to a consul. Other people had sort of gone to the peace talks and they didn't come back, so we were it. We had a staff. It was a very small staff. Ambassador. We didn't even have a defense attaché for a while. We were relying on an operations coordinator. He said, if we walk away from Liberia, Liberia's not coming back and we're not coming back into the situation. So what are you going to have? You're going to have a massive humanitarian crisis. How bad was it? At the time, in 2003 already, 50% of the country was refugees or IDPs. So 3 million people, 1.5 million people living out of the country or in IDP camps. Those IDP camps had been all throughout the interior of the country, but over time they were pushed into the city center. So when the rebels attacked, the IDP camps were in the way of the rebels. We ended up with 200,000 new people who were completely reliant on international relief for sustainment. And there was no infrastructure. Liberia had no functioning power grid, so it had no electricity. It had no sewer system, and really not a lot of sources of clean water. So this was the state that Monrovia was in, with 200,000 IDPs, with another several 100,000 people who were already living in very, very tough conditions. You walk away from that, you're looking at repeat on the order of, at best, the factional fighting of the 90s, which killed hundreds and thousands of people. And at worst, you could get into a genocidal type of ethnic reprisals and killing that would be on an unspeakable, there's unspeakable parallels. So he says, okay, well, first of all, the right thing to do is to try to help this situation. Where we were funding, the United States government was funding most of the NGOs that were there. Since it wasn't in the news, there wasn't a lot of attention, and therefore there weren't a lot of NGOs, and it was just kind of piecemeal. And the UN couldn't do very much. There wasn't much attention to the UN mission there. So that was his first priority, is that there's a moral component to this. The second, from a U.S. perspective, was that this is a place that we just had been making the case that we want to make sure that places like Afghanistan don't become dark spaces on a map where various actors, particularly terrorists, which was the words of the time, could take advantage of. These are, the words that were in vogue were ungoverned spaces. And, you don't want Liberia to become yet another ungoverned space. Eventually, the problems will come there, and they will metastasize and leave. And then you're going to have to deal with it anyway. So while you're there, you try to make a difference. And then the third thing we've just seen, they had an outbreak of Ebola there recently. And just to talk about the topicality of this time and place, you can imagine if Liberia had not stabilized, found its footing, rebuilt its defense forces, how you'd be trying to manage that crisis, which was already hard hit. They already struggled to contain it, but it would be all over the place if it were a bunch of factions fighting, and of course that war would have continued to destabilize the rest of the area. So the ambassador made the decision to stay, and over the course of the 3 months, we were able to hold the line and create a situation where it gave the international community enough time to respond. They put together a peacekeeping force. And then this is the last key point, and then I'll open it up for discussion, but peacekeeping forces don't just materialize. It's a highly complex exercise, a lot of different variables. You're asking people from Nigeria to go into Liberia and try to separate warring parties in a highly complex situation with no political agreement in place. So you have that challenge, and overlaid on that challenge was the fact that they had done interventions in the 90s, and the intervention force from ECOWAS had been drawn into the conflict and become party to the conflict. So the challenge for us was, if ECOWAS is going to come in, and that's who the international community is going to tap to sort of help separate the warring parties and create a situation where you can get to peace, how do you rebuild the trust of the various Liberian factions that this is a neutral party? So the Lord's perspective, the rebel group that was occupying half the city, was the moment you put an intervention force in, that's there to provide a buffer for Charles Taylor so he can rearm and re-attack us. Taylor's people had killed peacekeepers before, so there was a sense that we can kind of play this and we can maybe leverage them. They actually, after the peacekeepers arrived, they actually flew in an arms shipment and tried to launch a second attack, and the peacekeepers intercepted it. It was a little easy to intercept since the peacekeepers were at the airport and the arms came in through the airport. But Taylor's people were surprised. They thought No, we have a right to defend ourselves, and we're defending ourselves. So, so how do you get, and then the last point is with the city divided, the rebels were, and Taylor's people were indiscriminately shooting anything. And you had this massive concentration of people that were getting mortared and shot by stray bullets on a daily basis. And so how do you do that? Well, the way we did it is we got the contact information from the rebels and negotiated our way through the front lines 3 times to go talk to the rebels face to face, bring the Nigerian force commander with us and say, these guys are here as part of the international community. You need to leave the city voluntarily. You need to pull back because we got to get space to get relief in and let the peacekeeping deployment take place peacefully. Obviously, the rebels didn't want to leave because then they're leaving in the hands of Charles Taylor. So they needed a signal that Taylor would go. But even after Taylor left, they were basically in control of the city. So now, how do you do it? And the way you do it is that classic diplomacy where you're in the room with the rebels in rebel-held territory, and then you got to go back through with Charles Taylor's people and convince them that the rebels are going to accept your interim situation, they're going to leave, here's what is expected of your forces, here's what's expected of the rebels' forces. It was ultimately successful. ECOWAS this time had a lot more training, a lot more preparation, and President Bush sent a small contingent. It wasn't a small contingent. He sent a joint task force of 3 battleships to come and essentially show presence and have overflights and essentially support ECOWAS so that when they were deploying, they were seen as part and parcel of a U.S. Backed military deployment. And so the rebels knew there was overwhelming firepower, so did Taylor's people, that if the peacekeepers got in trouble, there would be support for them. And that is essentially the story of how on the ground, the war ended. Now, after the rebels voluntarily pulled out of the city was reunited, relief supplies started to come in, and they gradually expanded the security perimeter of the ECOMIL troops, the West Africans who were leading the peacekeeping effort. Then they were able to get the peace agreement in Accra that finally ended the war. And I always stress that, obviously, Liberians ended the Liberian Civil War. It doesn't end without the choices that the Liberian people themselves made to put the war behind them. But when a situation is as broken and the trust has broken down so much, and there's such an overlaid history of reprisals and horrible atrocities that have been committed, to rebuild that trust, that's where diplomacy can play a role. And that's where international diplomacy can play a role in supporting and stitching back together the relationships to allow a reset of some sense. And that's essentially the story, and so I'm happy to have a conversation about it.
What a story. So I think the idea is that Sarah and I will have a couple of questions and then open up the discussion. And I will say in advance, I've already apologized to Dante, though given how State Department hierarchies work, I hope he understands that I have to sneak out a little bit early because I have to meet a sitting U.S. ambassador, which is apparently the appropriate etiquette, even though it's a little rude and I'd rather be here. So when I sneak out, that doesn't mean we're done. It means I'm just being rude to Dante and doing what one does for ambassadors. But Sarah, do you want to kick us off? Or?
Sure. I'll just start, and thank you, Dante, for coming and sharing this. I think there are so many pieces here, and I guess I'll just start with the first question of what made you think that this was, why did you want to tell the story now, right? And obviously the book writing process is such that it evolved over some time. It wasn't that just last year you decided to write this book, but what made you think this was an important story to share now?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. We, people that have been there on the ground, have wanted to tell the story for quite some time. I will get to in a moment why it's topical. it was an interesting time because Liberia did pop up in the headlines because of the potentiality of a U.S. troop deployment. So the country went from zero press coverage to folks in the international press had kind of gotten tired of Iraq. They had all done embeds, and they had gone in with the invasion. They'd done a bunch of embeds, and it seemed like the story was getting boring, if you can imagine that. So all the bureaus just literally sent the entire press corps over to Liberia. And so as a result, you know, there's been attention, there's documentary footage of that time, that extremely consequential time, including a friend of mine made a film, Liberian Uncivil War. There's another great film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is about women's efforts to, you know, force the peace in Accra. And, but a huge missing piece was the fact that, you know, the U.S. Embassy was a platform for this international deployment. And the story of Echo Mill, the story of the West African peacekeepers had not been told anywhere. And how it was possible that the peacekeepers were able to come in was only because you had an ambassador and a team that were putting themselves on the line, you know, and making the tough calls to be there to do that. Because frankly, it's unlikely that the Nigerians would have deployed or that they would have been able to keep themselves out of the conflict without that underlying U.S. support. And the U.S. support doesn't come and doesn't happen. It can happen monetarily, but it doesn't happen without the ambassador making that choice. And so it's, to my mind, obviously it's an incredible story. I mean, this is a, you know, in a concentrated time, you got one of the fastest peacekeeping deployments you've seen. And you have what the actions that were taken, you know, helped end a war. So that's a story that in many senses is a timeless story. But for folks looking at it today, you know, every day in the headlines, you're seeing tough choices being made. Do you keep open your embassy in South Sudan? Do you keep open your embassy in Yemen? What about Damascus, right? And that's just from a U.S. perspective, but countries all over the world are dealing with this. In these unstable situations, and particularly we have a new dynamic of, you know, ISIS, and which is a later generation of, you know, Al-Qaeda. You see these questions being posed. Or when Ebola breaks out, you know, the tendency is to pull back, close the borders, do whatever it is to somehow seal us off. And yet we're in a completely integrated world where, you know, people, you know, diseases, money, it's all flowing, and the presence, the diplomatic presence is incredibly important. And so how you make the choice, because if you choose wrong, and if you misread the situation, you can have terrible consequences for your people, for the country that you're in, I think remains highly relevant in the 21st century.
So I want to pick up on that, and I'm going to try to ask this question in a way that doesn't get you fired, which is about risk and risk management. As some of you know, I wrote this thing called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review for Secretary Clinton, which was sort of her foreign policy statement document, and had more meetings than I'm allowed to discuss publicly about risk management questions. And the fundamental question at stake is, how much risk should we put our foreign service officers in? And to contextualize that a little bit, we assume that some number of American military personnel will die. It is a tragic fact, but that's sort of built into the assumption. And when that happens, we respect them and we thank them for their service or thank their families, but it is not a political catastrophe. Whereas when a foreign service officer dies, it is clear that we've done something wrong and failed to protect them. Yet the very fact of being in the kinds of places that you talk about being in is dangerous. And I guess I'm wondering how you, as someone who has been there, think about that. How do we both protect our foreign service officers but also allow them to do the work they need to do? And do we need to change our mentality about the amount of risk we should be politically willing to assume, and that a Foreign Service officer who signs up for a job of service to their country should assume is going to be part of that job? And you can dodge and duck in ways that you have to.
It's a great question. Here's what I would say. I've been in a number of situations over the course of my career. It's getting harder and harder to avoid those if you have a long diplomatic career. We are in, there's a lot more sort of areas that are, challenging where we continue to be a symbol that is something that folks are going to look to attack. With that said, there's risk everywhere, right? This is the world we're living in right now. I mean, there's risk, you go to a marathon and standing at the finish line in Boston, large crowds, you're potentially taking risks. What I would say, though, if you're talking about, what is the commitment that it takes to, put your life on the line for the country, it really comes down to the policy choices, right? I would never want anybody to have their life put on the line with an incoherent policy. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have a good reason for doing what we're doing, you don't want to be there just to be there. But if there are real reasons and the policy establishment is willing to be somewhat supportive, and then we really should be there. Now, in terms of who's there, that's a fair question. Obviously, State Department is a lifelong career. This is true for a lot of foreign affairs agencies. And I think what you want to do is find personnel that understand what they're getting into and make sure you have the people that are at the right time in their career to do it and are able to be fully committed, but also understand the risks. You cannot undersell the risks. I mean, this is life and death stuff. So what you want to do is make sure you have a diplomatic corps that has a mix of folks at different stages in their career. There are times in a 30-year career you can do things. Obviously, we serve, at will, and we can be sent anywhere at the pleasure of the department. But unlike the military, you have the option of resigning. So you're not fully forced to go someplace that you fully disagree with the policy. But I think in general what you're looking for is people that feel that at that particular time in their life that they can and stand up and do it. And the good news is we have a lot of those folks, and you have a very diverse workforce that is ready to take on challenges. I mean, I think it's been proven pretty conclusively because we've sent folks to Afghanistan, Iraq, now 15 years alongside the military in many of these places. But we also have people in the places that you don't hear as much about. It's not a significant military, presence in a place like Juba. This is a place where it's diplomats are out there, and you're not in the rear with the gear, and you're really on the front line. So I think what you do is you calibrate the risk you're willing to take as an institution with the objective. I mean, is this really worth putting people's lives on the line? The harder challenge is that it's very easy from Washington to do the simple and safe thing, which is just to pull out. I mean, that's the easy thing to do because you'll never be blamed for pulling people out of a situation. You will get blamed and there will be crossfire if something goes wrong. And things go wrong. That's just the nature of conflict. But I think the main thing is we have to be present. We've got to be present. The United States has vast interests all over the world, and we are a leader. And when we are out, there's a vacuum in terms of international engagement. It's rare that other countries are going to step up at this point in time and fulfill that anchor role as a diplomatic institution. So,
thank you for your service.
Thank you.
So I want to follow up on that and a comment that you made earlier today in our class about the role of technology and how technology has changed that risk assessment, right? I mean, in many ways, there's a desire for the clean war where the drones go out and targeted killings, and so people don't necessarily have to be put at risk, right? And that's then balanced against constant media coverage of just the most atrocious atrocities, right? Nothing is left, nothing is sacred, right? Everything becomes part of the media stream. And so there are these sort of competing tensions going on that are displayed because of the evolution of media and technology. And I'm curious how that factors into the risk assessment and the pressures that you have in the embassy.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate it.
I feel terrible about it, but thank you.
No, thank you for. You know, the challenge in a media environment where we seem to have very personal and close interaction across thousands of miles away all the time is that you really can know and understand a situation. And it also gives the illusion that you can manage the situation without being there. The truth is that whether it's business or whether it's diplomacy, you know, person-to-person contact still makes a huge difference. Recently, the ambassador and I were talking, and he's got a great analogy. He's calling it the rock face of diplomacy and using a climbing analogy. And it's, you know, if you're climbing the rock, right, you're worried and you're considering the wind, temperature, the different toe holds that you can get, the type of rock you're climbing on, and you're right there. You are trying to understand the fabric and texture of everything to a certain degree of personal detail that gives you a sense of how to proceed. What decisions you can make to get to your ultimate goal, which is to get up to the top of the rock or the mountain. You know, if you're flying around, it's a little bit hard to really get a full sense of that. And no matter how skilled and technical your instruments are, you're still one step removed from that rock face. So you have to be there to try to create, because look, conflict is people. People are causing the conflict, and people are the ultimate wild card. The decisions that they make on an individual basis and how you influence them has to be done by other people. You talked about drones. I mean, that is, you know, an interesting case because you say, oh, well, you can just go ahead and, I don't know, solve something by blowing somebody up from miles and miles away. But the challenge is anybody who you know, works in counterterrorism will tell you, you have to know who you're shooting at. And the only way you understand that is if you're actually there. And the United States in Afghanistan, where I served, did run into a lot of problems over the course of this war by, you know, taking out targets on one side of a valley because they were fed information by the other side of the valley that those guys are Al-Qaeda. And then you find out that this was a long-standing clan dispute, and actually the guys who fed you the information may have been more partial to, you know, elements that are truly against the United States, but now they're your enemy. And you wouldn't really know that unless you're there on the ground, talking to both sides, trying to understand the variables and try to find out whether any side is willing to partner with us, ally with us, work with us toward what we perceive our national objectives to be. So, you know, technology creates that illusion, but the reality is always about people, and it's always much more complicated. So you have to engage people, and you have to be present to do that.
So I have a long list of questions to ask, but I want to give those of you here in the audience an opportunity, if you have questions to ask, to weigh in with any questions you all may have.
What precautions is the U.S. Embassy or government really taking right now in Liberia, given that the elections, the presidential elections are coming soon?
Yeah.
To ensure that it's not going to be as chaotic as the history
Yeah.
of elections has been in Liberia?
Well, You know, the challenge for embassies is that you don't really control anything in a country that you're assigned to, right? You can be there to encourage, provide observations, talk to a lot of parties. If you're coming from a country like the United States, where you've got some sway, and particularly in a place like Liberia, where we're often intimately involved in rebuilding the army, helping them with their health crisis, I think you have a little bit more currency. And in that case, what you want to do is be present, and you want to be talking to all the different players and strongly reminding everybody that this was a hard-won peace, that as you go into a tense time, an election time, those are often tense times in countries all over the world, that the minimum standard that everybody should be thinking about is nonviolence, not a violent response to whatever happens. And then, of course, I don't know our current posture in Liberia and sort of what the nature of our programs. I'm not serving there right now. But if you've got advisors in working with the police, that would be the message that you're pushing to all your interlocutors is, this is a time to engage the democratic process, but respect the results. And if you're troubled by the results, the answer is not, is to try to use legal means and peaceful means, but not violence. And that's the message you can send out, not only as the U.S., but as a diplomatic community. And that's a case where often, unilateral voice can be important if it's the United States, but what you want to do is work with as many partners as possible so that people who might be contemplating doing the wrong thing realize that if they want to continue to engage with the international community and not be in some way isolated or lose the relationships, that they should take that counsel on board, that advice as friends. You're doing this as friends. So that's the kind of thing that you would be doing as an embassy in a country that was going through a particularly potentially tense time.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting what you were saying about one of the necessary conditions to your being so effective in Liberia was the fact that the United States was a neutral party that both sides could sort of trust. I thought that was very interesting because they don't typically tend to think of the United States in these types of situations as being neutral. To what extent do you think that neutrality is sort of an aberration in
Yeah.
Liberia? And what's the importance of trying to maintain that in other high-intensity situations like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a critical point. The United States is most effective, and diplomats are most effective, if you're not a party to the conflict. And it is very hard, if you're the United States, not to be seen as a party to the conflict. And in fact, from Taylor's folks' perspective, we were a party to the conflict. They believed that we were supporting and providing material support and financing to the Lord rebels. And when I talked to J.T. Richardson, and this is in the book, about this, he was Taylor's national security advisor, I said, well, hey, the mortars that, some of the mortars seem to be coming from the rebels. They were hitting our compound. So we were under attack along with the population. And his response to me was telling. He said, well, you know how many glasses that my houseboy breaks? He said, I don't pay him to break those glasses. And his point was, these guys are doing your bidding, and you happen to be in the way. It's a cost of doing business, and so you guys, it's not, don't look at us. This is your own problem you created, but really, it's you know what you've created, and you happen to be in the way, but that's not what you're paying for. You're paying for Taylor to be ousted. So we also had to win some trust and credibility with Taylor's insiders and let them know that if Taylor left, which he did, he left voluntarily, that we were not going to just, as an international community, sanction the rebels just taking over the city and slaughtering people. So you have to appeal to their personal futures, their long-term future in the country. That some of them were potentially facing war crimes, themselves, but they have to make a calculus that if our guy goes, some of these equities are going to be protected. And so, while we weren't 100% neutral, because again, I don't think we ever are, what we were able to do is make a credible case that the United States' core interest was stability in Liberia, stabilizing Liberia. That was the core interest that we were arguing for. And I think it's a more credible argument than saying, oh, okay, we don't want to see Taylor go, because our policy was to remove Charles Taylor. And President Bush said Charles Taylor has to go. So, we weren't exactly neutral, but we were able to play a facilitative role because our core interest was that's stabilizing the country, helping with the humanitarian situation, and protecting a broader set of interests in regional stability. And I think having that conversation from that perspective did give us some credibility. It is harder in some other countries, and particularly now there are forces in the world that essentially see a inchoate and long-standing war as a war essentially with a US-led world order, and so that becomes much more challenging to play that role. But in Liberia, and this is where being on the ground, knowing the resources and knowing the variables at play, the ambassador believed that we could be taken as a credible facilitator. And if he didn't believe that, then we're putting ourselves at risk unnecessarily. And so the variable would have changed if Charles Taylor at any point had decided to send his folks against our embassy. Then it would have been hard to say, well, where's our role? He never did. The embassy did come under attack, and we were taking a lot of stray rounds, and some of those rounds may not have been stray. Taylor's folks were firing on IDPs that were holed up in one of our compounds. There were shots directed at us by some snipers, not sniper in the trained sense of the word, but people were taking shots at the embassy. So it's not like this was an entirely clean relationship. But the ambassador was able to say, okay, given the variables we have, there's a reason to be here, and we can manage the level of risk. What you can't manage is a mortar blast. So if that goes off and you're in the wrong place, that's it for you. But that was the calculus. And how do you do that in other countries is, again, knowing the variables. What is the history? What is the perception of the combatants of the United States? Are there people that want to talk with us? And if you understand those things, then you can make your decision. So.
I'm curious whether there were ever any moments where you thought the situation was not going to turn out positively, whether you were worried that things were just going to devolve. Maybe you could talk about one or two of those instances.
Yeah, well, the geography was such that in Monrovia that the capital is 30, 40 miles away from the airport, and there's no way in or out. You're on the coast, so in theory you could get a boat. So we had conducted a series of evacuations in the immediate wake of the first attack on the Capitol. Again, there were 3 waves of attacks. And then there was a big fight between the Pentagon, which wanted to close the embassy, pull out, and be done with Liberia. To that point, Liberia, the embassy Monrovia had been the most evacuated post in the previous 10 years. It had been evacuated 7 times, but it never closed. So these evacuations were a drawdown of staff, get Americans out of the country, help where you can. Well, this time, we didn't have any forces nearby, so the French conducted the first evacuation. And they evacuated, internationals and Lebanese community, and we evacuated close to 150 Americans. And then the Secretary Rumsfeld deployed an aircraft carrier to close us down, and he wanted the ambassador pulled. And it became a standoff between the ambassador, roughly, backed by Secretary Powell, and Secretary Rumsfeld, and there was a big standoff. And during that standoff, the rebels attacked a second time, and at that point, we didn't have any assets to get anybody out, and we were down to minimal security. And none of this happens unless you have a team of Marines protecting the embassy, but it's a handful of guys. And so these guys were there together with a contract guard force of about 200, but it's unarmed. And these are Liberians who are putting their lives on the line to protect our embassy with no weapons in an entirely weaponized place. So these guys are the heroes because at the end of the day, the ambassador felt, okay, right now, this patchwork defense is going to be able to hold the line. And we had enough confidence in everybody that they were going to stand their posts if attacked, whether by the rebels coming through or by Charles Taylor's people freaking out on the way out, that we can hold the line. But at that point, and at each interval, the ambassador had to reassess. And there were times where it looked like no help was coming. There wasn't going to be an intervention force. There wasn't going to be any other way to evacuate people. And at some point, you're looking at, yeah, sure, at that point, what can you do? What really kind of changed the equation was President Bush had a trip to Africa planned. And it was, the rebels attacked the first time in early June, and they attacked the second time in July. But he had a trip in late June. But his trip to Africa was July 7th. And so everybody asked the question, if you're going to travel to Africa and you're not going to address Liberia, a country that you guys helped found, what's your Africa policy? And he was touting some really good stuff. PEPFAR, trying to address HIV/AIDS. These are the early days of that program. But the conversation was dominated by, this country is melting down on your watch, and what are you going to do about it? And so he stood up and he said, Charles Taylor has to go. But then that begged the question of, okay, how is he going to go? And we on the ground had no idea. We didn't know, are you going to be able to piece together a peacekeeping force? And when would that force come? And so, yeah, there were moments sort of all along the way where you're looking at it and saying, we may not be able to hold the line. And the ambassador particularly was like, there came a point, several points where it was like, maybe I'm just overplaying it and I'm going to lose everybody's life. We're going to get overrun and folks are going to get killed. But in the end, he calibrated it correctly, and the help came, and we were able to get the diplomacy back on track. So.
I have time for, there's one more question over there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you know, if you can just speculate, but obviously in 2003, the U.S. had a pretty hard line about we need stability in Liberia. Do you know what changed? Was it something qualitatively different about the conflict in 2003 as opposed to, say, 1989 when Charles Taylor first started his kind of incursion against Doe? Or was it more on the U.S. side, like Bush's visit, the kind of real fear of ungoverned areas that changed this into the U.S. kind of, you mentioned evacuating embassy multiple times. Like, what changed them to taking such a hard line in 2003 as opposed to earlier in the first Civil War?
It's a great question. Let me start with 2003. It was not, as I said, it wasn't a slam dunk. There were deep divisions in the administration. So there were folks who were like, even though the ungoverned space argument was a straight national security argument, there were a lot of people who were basically finished with Liberia. And so they were more than, I wouldn't say happy, but they were willing to let it go. No question about it. So while the argument eventually turned in favor of, the president deciding to commit resources, that was in part because the embassy was on the news, and you had a flag there, and Liberians were bringing the bodies of their dead and piling them on the doorsteps of the embassy to tell the world, because they knew the cameras were trained on the embassy, to tell the world, you guys have to help us. We need some help. And this is Liberian people who are caught in the middle, right? Hundreds of thousands of people had nothing to do with the conflict, or are victims of the conflict. And they were, this tremendous pressure from the Liberian people themselves to end the war. And so, a response eventually came through some hard-fought internal, calculations. As for the calculations in 1989, I wasn't there. I can't really speak to the history. What I will say I found interesting looking back on it is, in 89, 90, 91, when we still had an outsized, we had just come off from an outsized influence in Liberia. We'd had it for many, many years. We had backed the Doe regime until 89. You can sort of make the case as to sort of why we left. It was the end of the Cold War. The evidence of human rights abuses were there from Doe, and we weren't going to continue to finance his regime. And then it was a collapse of the state. But from a U.S. interest, could you have done more? Sure. More could have been done to help stabilize it, but the government that you were supposed to partner with was a government that you were basically saying, this government is a predatory government. And so it became hard. Who's your partner on the ground, right? The more interesting question to me is why, in the same situation, at almost the parallel time, we intervened in Somalia. There was tremendous pressure to intervene in Somalia on strict humanitarian grounds, and so we sent ourselves into a situation where we had very little familiarity, and it didn't go well at all. And to me, it's a real missed opportunity. And again, I'm speaking entirely personal, that with the same resources you put into Somalia, you would have stabilized Liberia. We have a great relationship with the Liberian people already, long-standing relationship, and you probably could have achieved much better results. Whereas on the east side, you probably would have gotten the same results. I will say that the famine there was terrible. And so, what we were trying to do, what President Bush clearly was trying to do, was to answer the call to a horrible famine. But it was interesting. I mean, we just sent a lot more resources in that direction into a civil war and tough conditions that we didn't have as great familiarity with and understanding as we would have had we gone the Liberia direction. So it's one of those questions you can't really answer, but it certainly gives you pause, and is a reminder that resources properly deployed at the right time can probably go a long way to staving off conflict. And it's a lot less costly to send those resources in early, but it's harder politically. It's much easier to answer the appeal to the starving child or the crisis than it is to say, with a little extra push, X country can become a strong democratic ally, they're with us, or whatever your priority is. It's a good question.
So I thank you so much for joining us and sharing this, and that story sort of highlights the important and critical role that the Foreign Service plays, and the value of really having people who are willing to step forward and play that role and get the toe hold and the finger hold and really figure out what's going on as we move forward. Lots of takeaways for present day and lots more to explore in future conversations. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all for coming, and really appreciate you hosting.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.